He never took his company public, not once in 44 years of building the most recognizable industrial empire on Earth. While his rivals scrambled for Wall Street capital, Henry Ford answered to no one. No board, no shareholders, no bankers with opinions about his vision. And that choice, more than any single invention, is the key to understanding how rich he actually was. Because the number is almost impossible to hold in your mind. At his peak, Henry Ford's personal wealth was estimated at somewhere between $1 and $200 billion in today's money. Not a company valuation. His, personally. A figure that puts him comfortably in conversation with the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, and in certain calculations, ahead of them both. But wealth for Ford was never really about the money. It was about control. And that distinction between accumulating fortune and wielding power is what makes Henry Ford one of the most complicated financial figures in American history. To understand where that fortune came from, you have to go back to 1893. Ford was 30 years old, working as an engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit. He was comfortable, respected, he had a salary, and he was quietly building a gasoline engine in his kitchen on his spare time. That engine became a vehicle. That vehicle became an obsession. And that obsession, after 2 failed company attempts, became the Ford Motor Company, incorporated on June 16, 1903. The company launched with just $28,000 in paid-in capital from 12 investors. Ford himself held 25.5% of the shares. He was not the majority owner. He was not even close. And yet, from the first day, Ford Motor Company ran on Henry Ford's ideas and Henry Ford's instincts. The other investors were passengers. Ford's early cars were respectable machines for respectable buyers. But Ford had a different customer in mind. He wanted to sell a car to the man who built it. That ambition pointed him toward one specific design challenge. How do you build something extraordinary at a price ordinary people can actually pay? The answer arrived in 1908. The Model T launched at $825, already lean for a car of its quality. But the price was never the breakthrough. The breakthrough was what happened next. In 1913, Ford's engineers introduced the moving assembly line at the Highland Park plant. Before that line existed, it took 12.5 hours to assemble a Model T chassis. After 93 minutes. That is not an incremental improvement. That is a complete reimagining of what a factory could be. The implications for price were immediate and staggering. As production volume exploded, the cost per unit collapsed. By 1925, a Model T cost $260, a 68% reduction from the original price in 17 years. Ford was not just building cars. He was engineering deflation. And the market responded in kind. Over 15 million Model Ts were produced between 1908 and 1927. At the peak, Ford accounted for roughly half of all automobiles on Earth. That is a market dominance that no single company has achieved before or since in any major consumer product. But here is the thing about that dominance. It was built on a paradox. The assembly line made workers faster. It also made them miserable. The pace was relentless. The tasks were numbing, and turnover inside Ford's plants reached catastrophic levels. To hire 100 workers and keep them, Ford had to hire nearly 1,000. The labor math was breaking the business model. Ford's solution arrived on January 5, 1914. The $5 day. He nearly doubled the average auto worker's wage overnight, raising it from $2.34 per day to $5. The announcement sent 10,000 applicants to the gates of Highland Park the very next morning. The $5 day is usually remembered as generosity. It was also brilliant strategy. Higher wages meant lower turnover, which meant lower training costs, which meant a more productive floor. Ford understood something his competitors did not. Paying workers more could make a company more profitable, not less. There was another dimension to the wage that Ford openly stated and that modern readers find uncomfortable. He wanted his workers to be able to afford the cars they were building. The $5 day was, in part, a market creation strategy. Ford was manufacturing his own customer base. By 1919, Ford had made a decision that would define the financial architecture of his empire for the next 3 decades. He bought out every remaining minority shareholder in Ford Motor Company. Every single one. He and his son Edsel now owned 100% of the company, outright, completely, with no obligation to report to anyone. Think about what that means structurally. A privately held company does not have to disclose its earnings, its debts, or its strategic plans to anyone outside the ownership. Ford Motor Company was the largest private company in the world, and Henry Ford intended to keep it that way. The River Rouge complex, which Ford began building in the late 19-teens, was the physical embodiment of that ambition. It covered 1.5 square miles, 93 buildings, 100 miles of internal railroad track, its own hospital, its own fire department, its own power generation. At its peak, River Rouge employed over 100,000 workers, a city-sized workforce under a single owner's control. But the scale was not just about labor. It was about a concept called vertical integration, meaning Ford wanted to own every step of the production process, from raw material to finished product. Vertical integration, at its most extreme, means you never pay a middleman. You mine your own iron ore, you run your own ships, you smelt your own steel, and you sell the car yourself. River Rouge was so completely self-contained that raw iron ore went in one end and a finished automobile came out the other, in 28 hours. The financial power of that model is difficult to overstate. Every profit margin that would normally go to a supplier, a shipper, or a processor stayed inside Ford's balance sheet. He was not just running a car company, he was running an entire industrial supply chain and capturing the profit at every node. By the early 1920s, Ford's personal fortune was growing at a rate that defied ordinary comprehension. He had no public shareholders to pay dividends to. He had no Wall Street bankers setting terms. The profits of the largest industrial enterprise in the world flowed almost entirely to one man and his son. The wealth Ford accumulated was not sitting in a bank account. It was woven into land, factories, railroads, coal mines, iron ore deposits, timberland, and glass plants. This is what economists call illiquid wealth, assets that are enormously valuable but cannot be converted to cash quickly without collapsing their own market. Ford's empire was real, but it was architectural. It was everywhere, and it was immovable. This was both a strength and a vulnerability. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, Ford could not easily liquidate assets to ride out the storm. What he could do, what he did, was cut wages, accelerate production, and exercise the kind of top-down control that no publicly traded company could ever replicate. And yet, for all the financial mastery, Ford was also capable of staggering miscalculation. In 1927, Ford shut down production entirely for 6 months to retool from the Model T to the Model A, a pause that cost the company somewhere between $200 and $250 million in lost revenue. He did it anyway, because he owned the company and he could absorb the loss in a way no shareholder accountable executive ever would. There were other miscalculations, ones that cost more than money. Ford purchased a tract of land in the Brazilian Amazon with the intention of growing rubber for his tires. Fordlandia, as it became known, was meant to complete the vertical integration loop. It cost approximately $20 million to develop. Ford employed thousands of workers there under conditions that sparked multiple labor riots, and the project failed comprehensively, because rubber trees in dense concentration are uniquely vulnerable to disease. Ford sold Fordlandia back to the Brazilian government in 1945 for $250,000. Fordlandia was not a financial catastrophe by the scale of Ford's empire, but it was a revealing one. The same absolute control that made River Rouge possible, the refusal to listen to experts, the imposition of Ford's personal vision onto an ecosystem he did not understand, produced one of the most expensive agricultural failures in American corporate history. Now the story reaches its most uncomfortable passage, and the numbers recede here because what Ford did next cannot be measured in dollars. In 1919, Ford purchased a small regional newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. Over the next 8 years, he transformed it into a national publication with a circulation of 900,000 and used it to publish 91 consecutive weeks of virulently anti-Semitic articles. The series was collected and distributed internationally under the title The International Jew. Adolf Hitler kept a portrait of Henry Ford in his Munich office. He cited Ford by name in Mein Kampf as the only American he admired. In 1938, the Nazi government awarded Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor the Third Reich gave to foreign civilians. Ford accepted it. He was 75 years old. He knew exactly what it represented. You do not need to reach for euphemism here. Ford used his wealth and his platform to spread hatred at an industrial scale. The same infrastructure that distributed Model Ts, the dealer networks, the print channels, the institutional reach, was used to distribute propaganda. The empire and the ideology were inseparable. Ford eventually issued a retraction in 1927 under legal pressure. Historians debate whether it reflected genuine remorse or tactical calculation. The Dearborn Independent ceased publication that same year, but the articles remained in circulation in Europe for decades. The damage was not retractable. By the 1930s, Ford's competitive position was in serious decline. General Motors had outmaneuvered him by offering multiple models at multiple price points, a strategy Ford had dismissed as unnecessary. The Ford Motor Company, which had once held 50% of the American market, was fighting for survival against competitors it had once considered irrelevant. Ford's response was not strategic flexibility. It was stubbornness. He resisted unionization with a ferocity that turned violent. The 1937 Battle of the Overpass, in which Ford's security forces beat union organizers in front of photographers, became one of the defining images of American labor history. Ford was the last of the major automakers to sign a union contract, doing so only in 1941. The man who had voluntarily doubled wages in 1914 spent the next 27 years fighting to deny workers any organized voice. The contradiction was not lost on anyone. Henry Ford died on April 7, 1947, at the age of 83. The bulk of his estate, the non-voting shares that represented most of the company's equity, went to the Ford Foundation, a philanthropic organization. This structure had a secondary effect. It allowed the Ford family to retain voting control while dramatically reducing the estate tax burden. The philanthropy was genuine. The tax architecture was also deliberate. 9 years after Ford's death in 1956, Ford Motor Company held its initial public offering, the moment a company first sells shares to the general public. It was the largest IPO in American history at that time, raising over $650 million. The company Ford had refused to share with the world for 44 years finally entered the market. It did so only after he was gone. So, what was Henry Ford actually worth? The honest answer is that no precise figure exists, because Ford's wealth was never fully liquid and was never fully disclosed. Estimates place his peak net worth, adjusted to current values, between $100 and $200 billion. In that range, he stands alongside Rockefeller and Carnegie as one of the 3 or 4 wealthiest Americans who ever lived. But the comparison to Rockefeller and Carnegie reveals something important. Rockefeller built his fortune through monopolistic control of an existing commodity, oil. Carnegie built his through vertical integration of steel. Ford built his through something those men never fully managed. He invented a new way of making things, and then built the empire on top of the invention. The genius and the wealth were not separable. And yet, this is the question the numbers cannot answer. How much of Ford's influence came from the money, and how much from the ideas? The assembly line would have changed the world regardless of who owned it. The $5 day reshaped the American working class whether or not Ford had a second motive. The Model T put mobility into hands that had never known it, regardless of the man who built it. Ford's ideas had mass. His money had leverage. But his character, the rigidity, the paranoia, the willingness to use that leverage for hatred, left a shadow that the factories could not outrun. Return, for a moment, to that kitchen in 1893. A 30-year-old engineer working by lamplight, building an engine no one asked him to build. He was not chasing a fortune. He was chasing a problem. The fortune arrived because the problem mattered and because he solved it better than anyone else alive. That is the core of Henry Ford, a man whose greatest gift was the ability to see a system, to see all the friction, all the waste, all the unnecessary steps, and then to eliminate them one by one until something that had taken 12 hours took 93 minutes. That gift built one of the largest personal fortunes in human history. It also built institutions, wages, and mobility that outlasted him by generations. What you carry out of this story is not a number, it is a framework. Wealth at this scale is never just money. It is the crystallized form of ideas, labor, control, and consequence. Ford's ledger contains all four. The genius and the damage are written in the same hand. And that finally is what makes him impossible to look away from.